Well, thanks very much for that. I'm very glad to be able to stand in for my friend and former colleague, David Goodhart, and allow him to surf in Devon or Cornwall or whatever, somewhere down there. Anyway, in the words of the colonel of the air cavalry in Apocalypse Now, Scots don't surf. When I was growing up in a seaside fishing village in East Scotland some time ago, my grandfather, who with my mother raised me, was a retired merchant seaman, he would say every so often, especially when he'd had a couple of drams, that there'll always be an England as long as Scotland's there. And it was not actually wrong in one sense. Of course, I believed it, him being my grandfather, but it was not wrong in the sense that there were Scots who hugely disproportionately ran the British Empire from top to bottom. Not something which the Scottish National Party makes much of now, since they're terribly anti-imperialist, but which nevertheless was true. For a Scot, perhaps especially a young Scot, it would seem to be that there's not all that many reasons for not voting nationalist. If you did so, you'd be embracing the independence of a nation which has retained, many of the features of the sovereign state it was until the first decade of the 18th century, when it joined a union with England. It had kept, in the union, the treaty said that it would keep control of education, it would have its own judicial system, both of which is still the case, and most important in those days, it would keep its own religion, which was Protestant but Presbyterian, unlike the Anglicans. Crucially, and this would, if you were this young Scot, be your cause as well as your complaint, it did not continue to have the ability to govern itself. That went to a joint parliament in Westminster and has remained there. And these governments in Westminster are inevitably dominated by the representatives of the 85% of the population, which is English, plus the very fact that Scotland had been a nation-state for some centuries, and the 1707 Union gave it the right to keep education and religion and the judiciary, meant that it was not solidly as integrated into the state as, for example, other European nation-states like Germany, Italy, France have been, and therefore was more open to being picked over. The integration was partial, it was more open to change and challenge than elsewhere. And the leaders were so inspiring. If you were a young person, you're Alex Salmond, who, since his resignation in 2014 after the loss of the referendum on independence, has worked profitably, some would say, for RT, Russia Today, on the principle that my enemy's enemy is my paymaster. Is one whose rhetorical passion and ability to dominate and charm was formidable. And Nicola Sturgeon, whose apparent efficiency and certainty, as well as being head and shoulders above any of her colleagues in the public presentation of both her party and herself, has made her among the most admired politicians in these islands, including among the English. Both Salmond and Sturgeon were hugely effective politicians. They made the blood run faster, which is what nationalists must do. That was indeed their intent. In contrast, for Scots who like to pride themselves, and we do like to pride ourselves on having a greater moral sense and egalitarian instincts than the English, always the comparison. The recent Conservative leaders, especially Cameron and Johnson, Eton and Oxford, have been gifts that have just gone on, especially with Boris Johnson giving. Johnson has trailed a past in right-wing journalism and a Wodehouseian sense of humour, which isn't to most Scots' taste. Wodehouse is to my taste, and I'm sure to some of you, you'll remember, I guess, I hope, that in one of his stories on Blandings Castle, not a Jeeves story, but a Blandings Castle, Lord Blandings goes to speak to his grumpy Scottish gardener, who grumps about his pay or whatever else. And after that, Wodehouse observes that it is never difficult to tell the difference between a ray of sunshine and a Scotsman with a grievance. Often quoted to Scots whose sense of humour sometimes don't rise to laughing at it. And Brexit, where Scots voted by nearly 2/3 to remain, is represented by the Scots Nats as a choice of a people, Scots people, at once more democratic, more European in their values, European good in their values, and less, and this is a measure of the nerve of the SNP, less nationalistic than the people down south. This is from the Scottish National Party. The way in which England, and particularly its politicians, are represented comes very near to an argument that the two nations are actually different civilizations. But this is only one of the many, many contradictions which is imminent in Scots nationalism. Among them is an ardent pro-Europeanism that Nicola Sturgeon argues that the ideals of the EU and those of the Scots, perfectly conventional ideals like belief in freedom and so forth, are consonant. And the hidden agenda is much more than the English. The ardent nationalism, which requires another union than that which was 300 plus years of British union as a safe harbour, meets the inevitable demands of that union for membership of the euro. So you have a national party which is to recover its sovereignty, entering a union which sooner or later, assuming that it continues on its present path, will ask them to lose much of that sovereignty, probably more than they presently have, with 300 years in which the English and the Scots and the Northern Irish and the Welsh have somehow managed to rub along, often somewhat with some bad grace at times, but nevertheless have come to more or less a settlement where the dominant English, the 85%, you people, have recognised that Scotland, perhaps especially Scotland, but Wales and Northern Ireland as well, have to have some rights which are greater than their membership of the Union would lead you to expect. That can be a bit artificial. But until the rise of the Scots National Party, it has worked. And it's worked well because Scots, including my grandfather, who said that there'll always be an England as long as Scotland's there, and who, it was before my time, but my granny told me that when Scots lawyers, 3 Scots young law students, I think, went to Westminster Abbey, then unguarded, and stole the stone of Scone from under the chair on which the monarch was crowned. The stone of Scone had been the stone, couldn't afford a chair, the stone on which kings of Scotland rather, were crowned, was then put under the common British throne. That had been stolen by these 3 lawyers and brought back to Scotland, where ultimately it was recovered. But my granny said it was the first time that she had seen her husband laugh for a very long time. Yet he would never think of voting for other than a unionist party. The Scots nationalists then, and they existed, indeed the provost or the mayor of a neighbouring village was a Scots Nat. My grandfather and his generation, my mother's generation, they would never think of voting nationalist. The response to England was a kind of somewhat, at times, bitter, nearly always humorous, kind of tough teasing. Perhaps not quite seen that way by English, but certainly by the Scots, within the overall covering nation of Britain, this new nation, which was never much loved as Britain, but existed to give people their rights, and in 2 world wars of the last century, to bring people together to fight for it. And few fought with such dedication as the Scots and the Northern Irish, and of course the Welsh and the English as well. The main reason given to Scots in the last 2 or 3 decades by unionists for staying in the Union has been largely economic. And that's fair enough, it seems to me. It's fair enough because that's how the Union, the British Union, is organised. The ardent nationalism which requires another union, the European Union, requires it because the Scots Nats know that to leave this union and go out into the world without another safe harbour, or apparently safe harbour, would simply be a reason for the Scots not to vote nationalist. You need to have something which will embrace Scotland, and the SNP has been very ardent, very careful to make the cause for joining the European Union a strong one, which seems to have gone down well. But actually, it's a contradiction. This union, which is described by Sturgeon as being an all-welcoming, all-embracing, all-liberal, like Scotland, union, actually will require Scotland to ditch much of what it says it wishes to do. The EU, for example, demands that any future applicant must have its own currency when it joins. Scotland hasn't got its own currency, or rather it has, but it's got a British currency. If it were to become a member of the European Union, it could not keep a British currency, and yet all but 17% of the Scots wish to keep the pound because it's become something which is trusted. It will not have to join the euro immediately, but it will have to at some not too distant point, including Schengen. It must also sign up, and this has been made quite clear in some speeches by, hardly ever reported in Scotland, by officials of the European Union. It will have to agree to an ever closer union. All these things, as I say, are not given much publicity, but they all will happen if it joins. Though I have to say I think it's unlikely that it will. It's true that a well-run economy, as in most of the Scandinavian countries, which the SNP likes to compare itself with when it's going to be independent, have differing policies on currencies. But Scotland, under the SNP, is not a well-run economy. Its deficit, already large, has ballooned in the COVID period. It's covered now because it's a member of the British Union. But once independent, it would have to cope with it itself. It would have to create its own currency before it joined, Scottish pound or Scottish, whatever it might be. and that, given the deficit, that currency would immediately devalue on independence. Its health service is now turning people away from A&E. The Scottish Health Secretary advises them to go and see a doctor, and it's quite difficult to see a doctor, even more difficult than it is here. Its education system, which was once its great pride, possibly a bit too much pride, but it was, to some extent, well-founded. It's now at the bottom of the table for the UK. Every other nation, especially England, but also Wales, which had been the bottom, and Northern Ireland, are better at education than Scotland is. It's now also very far down the PISA table, the international table for education. The fact that the COP is taking place in Glasgow, the biggest city of Scotland, has put the spotlight on a city that's particularly badly run. It's a badly governed mess, and the council is SNP. Indeed, the leader of the SNP and the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, is a Glasgow MSP. This leaves Scotland and the nationalists in something of a dilemma. Independence is incompatible with growth and rising or even flatlining living standards. All economists, including many of those who had in the past advised the Scottish National Party, agree on that. But the SNP will not make that clear. They will not tell the truth on the economy. The best-known Scots historian, Tom Devine, who has in the past supported nationalists, now says he will not in future unless they admit that this is so, but they cannot, or at least do not. Fears on the economy and on living standards may, if another independence vote is taken at the moment, as you will know, it's been denied by Westminster, but if it is taken, it may again produce the result of 2014, a split of around 55% against independence and 45% for. But such a vote is, as the SNP says, a reaction of fear of loss of living standards. The SNP mocks that. It says the Scots are, in Scots, feared. But it's perfectly irrational to be frightened that you're going to lose living standards for yourself and for your family in the future. Perfectly irrational fear, and one which produces a no vote because of that. But it would, however, seem rather like a loveless marriage, where Scots remain in the Union to retain the Barnett formula. So what's the positive case for union? The UK is a union of nations, preserving much of their culture and distinctiveness, but which is also organised as almost a unitary state, or most federal states are, where public services are maintained at roughly the same level among the nations and the regions. This is a political and economic matter, but it's also a moral one. We've agreed, we British have agreed, tacitly to be sure and at times resentfully, to equalise ourselves by using differential tax raised in the regions to bring public services up to a common level. In fact, the much larger tax take in London and the South East buoys up these other regions, especially perhaps Wales and Northern Ireland. Scotland actually does quite well, but for some reason, which nobody really has defined properly, gets an awful lot more than its economic level would tend to suggest, partly through the so-called Barnett formula, which is 12 billion or so a year. And although that, in these days where billions are thrown around like confetti, doesn't sound much, is a large part of the Scots budget. We accept, as I say, that we are one people, while at the same time, Northerners, Scots people and so on, quite like to show or to express contempt for the overpaid Southerners. and especially the Londoners. Second, our histories are diverse. Our histories in this country are diverse among the nations, very diverse, hard diverse sometimes, wars, raids, imperialism in Ireland. But at least over the past century, these have been shared. That includes 2 world wars, the common development of a welfare state. The National Health Service was brought in by a Welshman, and greater power and influence of the national media, which, for all of its many faults, especially the BBC, tends to have drawn the country together again with a common language, common programs which are enjoyed everywhere. A Scots think tank recently published in the last couple of months a survey showing that on most issues, Scots and English views differ little. Another policy institute, British Future, based in London, did a poll in September a couple of years ago which showed that Scots and English attitudes to immigration were almost exactly the same. That is, some 2/3 of both the Scots and the English wanted low-skilled immigration, especially low-skilled immigration, to be reduced. Scotland has a much smaller number of migrants, proportionately as well as, of course, absolutely, than England. Though SNP propaganda, SNP speeches consistently paints England as a prey to the most vicious imperialist racism, and seeks to prove it at every possible turn. These similarities in attitudes and reactions, both good and bad, reflect centuries of mixing among us, of intermarriage, of common membership, of unions, of clubs, of institutions, employment in the same public and private corporations. Nothing as dense and humanly supportive as this exists or could exist or is likely ever to exist in the European Union. I said that Scots believe that they are a much more moral opinion, a much more moral people, a view apparently which is shared by a number of English intellectuals, which is a kind of indication that what George Orwell wrote in England, They Are England about the English intellectuals' talent for self-flagellation is probably true. I was told, this isn't confined to nationalists, I was told some years ago by a very senior Labour Member of Parliament that I should take note that, yet again, we are a more moral people. I didn't think of it at the time, I wish I had, but I thought later, yet this man wants to govern a nation composed mainly of deeply immoral people. It's a constant theme of nationalist speeches and of journalism. Yet their present position, the nationalists, is an exercise of immorality. All politicians must say that things can only get better under their rule. And in a way, fair enough. This is a democracy. It would be a strange politician who went into politics not to think that his or her party could make a difference for the better. But when the nationalists insist that independence has no, or at worst, only a brief and transient cost to be paid, this passes the normal cut and thrust of democratic politics and reaches into an immoral position. As does the rabid denigration of the English, a tradition immeasurably strengthened in the past century by Scotland's most famous poet, Hugh MacDiarmid, who died some years ago, loaded with laudations, and more recently by the nationalist ideological guru and inspiration, Tom Nairn, for whom England was a rotting imperial remnant, and I quote that, from which Scotland must separate for its own survival. The SNP, by taking that position and by ramming it down the throats of Scots for the last 20 years, more or less 20 years since it's been in power, is an immoral party. Profiting from the decline of the Labour Party, once hegemonic in Scotland, and also the decline of the Tories, who have similarly declined rather before that, except for the brief period where Ruth Davidson was a leader of the Scottish Tories, has meant that the nationalists have cranked up the flow of separatist nationalism from a union which brought and still brings to Scotland huge advantages, refusing to discuss or lying about the economic future. The Nats parade themselves in virtue and govern in vice. To unmark their mendacities is a task that a party like the SDP might join in undertaking. The SDP does claim an interest, as we've heard today, in a new morality in politics, and, as Patrick O'Flynn was saying, is seen to take politics seriously, more seriously than the other parties, and few things, seems to me, are more serious than maintaining the British Union. For all its faults, Britain, Great Britain, can clearly claim to be an engaged and often positive, I will not say progressive, but positive part, to play a positive part in the world. And as Mohammed Abbasi was saying and was underscoring, is still attached, for all its challenges, and some of the challenges which Eric brought up are large, all the challenges to freedom, to free speech, freedom to publish, and freedom to disagree, to dispute and question. These freedoms can be protected much better in a union like ours, which, after all, is no stranger to dispute and disagreement, than for Scotland to hive off and leave this union hugely weakened.